Somewhere between a leaking coolant pipe and a jammed air filter, Dale Rowan heard the laughter. It came floating through the ventilation shaft he had been working inside for the past 2 hours, thin and high and full of that particular cruelty that only children could produce without knowing what they were doing. He paused, wrench in hand, grease streaking both his forearms, and he listened. He was lying on his back inside a narrow maintenance crawlway on level 6 of Bridgepoint Station. The station was old. It had been built 40 years ago as a trade hub and refueling post between 3 different galactic shipping lanes, and every single year of those 40 showed in its bones. Pipes rattled, panels flickered. The heating system had moods, and Dale was the one who kept it all breathing. He was the only full-time human mechanic on the station. There were a few other humans scattered around Bridgepoint, mostly traders passing through or a couple of researchers renting lab space on level 9. But Dale lived here. He had lived here for 6 years. He knew the station better than anyone alive, better than the engineers who had originally designed it, because he had spent thousands of hours crawling through its guts, replacing what was broken, reinforcing what was weak, and whispering encouragement to machines that should have quit working long ago. Nobody paid much attention to Dale. He was a death worlder. That was the polite term the galactic community used for species that evolved on worlds classified as hostile. Earth qualified. High gravity, extreme temperature swings, an atmosphere full of corrosive oxygen, oceans of salt water, and a biosphere where nearly everything was trying to eat everything else. Most alien species looked at humans the way someone might look at a cockroach that had learned to fix engines. Impressive in a way, but not the kind of thing you invited to dinner. The laughter came again. Dale slid out of the crawlway and stood up, rolling his shoulders. He followed the sound down the corridor to the learning hall on level 6. It was a big open space with curved walls and soft lighting, designed for the station's youngest residents. About 50 alien children from at least 6 different species sat in a wide circle on cushioned platforms. 3 teachers stood near the center, and on the main display screen behind them, a familiar image glowed. It was a picture of a wolf. A cartoon wolf, standing outside a straw house, cheeks puffed out, ready to blow. Today was Cultural Exchange Day. Each species on the station was supposed to share stories from their homeworld. The human contribution had been a recording of 3 classic Earth fairy tales. The 3 Little Pigs, Jack and the Beanstalk, Little Red Riding Hood. Simple stories, old stories, the kind of stories that every human child had heard at least once before they could even read. The recording had just finished, and the children were falling over themselves laughing. A small Relavi child in the front row was laughing the loudest. Relavi were slender, blue-skinned, with oversized eyes that made them look permanently startled. This one, a girl named Sarah, was holding her sides and gasping. She stood up and pointed at the screen where the wolf was still frozen mid-blow. "This is what humans teach their babies," she said. "That a wolf can blow down a house. That a plant can grow into the sky. That a little girl can survive a monster by talking to it." She looked around at the other children, feeding off their laughter. No wonder they are mechanics and not scientists. The other children roared. A group of Telic youngsters, covered in soft brown fur, clapped their 4 hands together in their species' version of applause. Even a couple of the teachers smiled behind their hands, not bothering to correct the behavior. Dale stood in the doorway. He was still holding his wrench. His coveralls were stained with coolant and dust. He watched Sarah take a little bow while the other children cheered her on. He watched the teachers look the other way. He watched the cartoon wolf on the screen, frozen in its eternal effort to blow down something stronger than itself. He did not say a word. He did not step inside. He did not correct anyone or defend anything. He just stood there for a long, quiet moment, and something shifted behind his eyes. Not anger, not hurt, something deeper and much more patient than either of those things. Then he put his wrench back on his belt, wiped his hands on his coveralls, and walked away down the corridor. Behind him, the laughter continued. The children had already moved on to the next species stories, something involving mathematical proofs set to music, and they listened to those with wide-eyed respect. Nobody noticed the human leave. Nobody ever noticed the human at all. That was fine. Dale had spent his whole life being underestimated. He had learned a long time ago that the people who laughed first were rarely the ones still standing at the end. That he had work to do. There was a pressure regulator on level 3 that was making a sound he did not like, and the station was not going to fix itself. The thing about keeping a space station alive was that nobody thanked you when things worked. They only noticed when things broke. And since Dale Rowan was very good at his job, almost nobody on Bridgepoint noticed him at all that he had a routine. He woke at what the station called 0500, which meant nothing in real terms since there was no sun out here, just the cold black of deep space and the distant smear of a nebula that glowed faintly pink on the starboard observation deck. He ate alone in his small quarters on level 2. Protein bar. Instant coffee made from a packet he had shipped in from Earth once every 3 months because no alien species in the known galaxy had figured out coffee, and he was not about to explain it to them. Then he pulled on his coveralls, clipped his tool belt around his waist, and he went to work. His workshop was a cluttered room near the station's lower core. Shelves lined every wall, packed with spare parts, salvage components, hand-labeled containers of bolts, and washers and seals. A battered metal desk sat in the corner, buried under repair logs and diagnostic printouts. The room smelled like machine oil and solder. It was the only place on the station that smelled like Earth to him, and he liked that. Dale's daily rounds took him through every level of Bridgepoint. He checked pressure seals on level 1. He tested oxygen recyclers on level 4. He calibrated the gravity plating on level 7, which had a habit of drifting 0.5% every few weeks, just enough to make the Relavi residents feel dizzy without understanding why. He fixed it every time. Nobody knew he fixed it. Nobody asked. That morning, he was replacing a corroded water pipe on level 5 when Counselor Paleth walked past. Paleth was the station administrator. She was a Vren, a tall insectoid species with a hard black shell and 4 jointed arms that folded neatly behind her back when she was not using them. She had a reputation for efficiency and a voice like dry paper being torn in half. She ran Bridgepoint the way a surgeon ran an operating room. Clean, precise, no room for anything that did not serve a purpose. Dale was on his knees with his upper body inside a wall panel when Paleth's sharp footsteps clicked past him. She did not slow down. She did not acknowledge him. She spoke into her communicator as she walked, discussing supply shipments and docking schedules. Dale might as well have been part of the wall, that he was used to it. Most of the station's residents treated him the same way. Polite enough when they needed something fixed, invisible the rest of the time. A death worlder with dirty hands and a quiet voice was easy to forget. The only exception was Grenna. She found him later that afternoon in the trade corridor on level 3, where he was adjusting a flickering light panel above her shop. Grenna was a Fen, a species that looked like a cross between an otter and a small bear, with round dark eyes and dense gray fur. She sold imported fabrics and handmade goods from a dozen different worlds. Her shop was warm and colorful and always smelled like spiced tea, and she was one of the few beings on the station who consistently treated Dale like a person rather than a tool. "You look tired today," she said, standing below him while he worked on a ladder. "Always look tired," Dale said. "It is the human face. We are not designed for beauty." Grenna laughed. It was a soft rolling sound like a purr. "I heard about the cultural exchange yesterday. The children's session." Dale did not look down. He kept his hands busy with the light panel. Word travels fast. On a station this size, everything travels fast. She paused. "They laughed at your stories." "They did. Does that bother you?" Dale finished tightening a connection, and the light above them stopped flickering. Steady warm light filled the corridor. He climbed down the ladder and folded it up, tucking it under his arm. He looked at Grenna for a moment, and there was something in his expression that was hard to read. Not sadness, not frustration, something like patience. "When I was a boy," he said, "my grandmother used to read me those stories every night. The Three Little Pigs was my favorite. She would do all the voices. The wolf, the pigs, all of them. She was not a scientist. She never left our town. She worked in a factory her whole life. But she taught me something with that story that no textbook ever could." Grenna tilted her head. "What did she teach you?" "She taught me that the small and the weak can win," Dale said. "That if you build strong enough and hold your ground, Nothing can blow you down. Not the storm, not the wolf, not anything. He shrugged. That matters more than most people think. Grinna studied him with those round dark eyes. She did not fully understand what he meant. The Fen had their own stories, their own traditions, but they were a gentle species from a gentle world. They had never needed to teach their children about wolves. "You are a strange species," she said warmly. "We know," Dale said, and he walked away to fix the next thing that was broken. That night, alone in his quarters, Dale sat on the edge of his bunk and held a small object in his hands. It was a paper book, battered and old, with a torn cover showing a cartoon pig building a house out of red bricks. His grandmother's book, the only thing he had brought from Earth that was not a tool. He ran his thumb over the faded cover and set it carefully back on his shelf. Then he turned off the light and slept the deep, dreamless sleep of a man who had earned his rest. 3 days after the children laughed at fairy tales, the sky fell in. Or rather, the space around Bridgepoint Station decided to stop being polite. Ion storms were a known hazard in this sector. They rolled through like invisible tidal waves, massive clouds of charged particles that could fry electronics, scramble navigation systems, and peel the paint off a starship's hull if the shielding was not strong enough. Bridgepoint had weathered dozens of them over the years. The station's outer shields were rated for Class 4 storms, and most ion events in this corridor barely reached Class 2. This one was a Class 5. The warning came from a long-range sensor buoy only 18 minutes before the storm hit. 18 minutes was nothing. Counselor Paleth ordered an immediate lockdown from the command deck on Level 1. Blast shutters closed over every external viewport. Non-essential systems powered down. Residents were told to move to interior sections and wait. Then the storm arrived, and it was worse than anyone expected. The first wave hit Bridgepoint like a hammer. The entire station groaned, a deep metallic sound that Dale felt in his teeth. He was in his workshop on the lower core when the lights flickered once, twice, and then cut to emergency red. The floor vibrated beneath his boots. He grabbed the edge of his workbench and held on while the station shuddered around him. The shields held. They were designed to hold. But the storm was not just hitting from outside. Ion storms at this intensity generated electromagnetic pulses that bled through shielding and wreaked havoc on internal systems. Within the first 5 minutes, 3 separate power relays overloaded on levels 4 and 6. The backup generators kicked in, but they were 40 years old, same as everything else on this station, and they stuttered like a dying engine. Dale was already moving. He did not wait for orders. He pulled on his heavy work gloves, grabbed his emergency kit, and headed for the nearest maintenance access ladder. His communicator buzzed with chatter from the command deck. Paleth's voice, sharp and controlled, calling out system failures like a surgeon listing injuries. Heating failure on Level 6 residential wing. Water recycler offline on Level 3. Gravity fluctuation on Level 8. And then the call that stopped everything. Hull microfracture detected. Section 14, Level 6. Atmosphere loss in progress. Dale's blood went cold. Section 14 was the learning hall. The children's quarter that he changed direction immediately, climbing faster now, his boots clanging on the metal rungs. His communicator kept feeding him information. The fracture was small, barely 2 centimeters wide, but it was in the outer hull where the station's skin was thinnest. Air was leaking out into space. Not fast enough to cause explosive decompression, but fast enough that pressure was dropping steadily. The emergency bulkheads had already slammed shut around the section, sealing it off from the rest of the station to prevent further loss. That meant everyone inside was trapped. Dale reached Level 6 and sprinted down the corridor to the Section 14 bulkhead. A cluster of station personnel were already gathered there. 2 Vren engineers stood with their diagnostic tablets, clicking at each other in their rapid native language. A Telic security officer paced back and forth, his fur bristling. And Counselor Paleth stood in the center, all 4 of her arms folded tightly, her compound eyes scanning the data on a wall-mounted display. "Report," she said as Dale approached. "Point," one of the Vren engineers answered. "The fracture is in maintenance crawlway 14C. It runs along the outer hull between the learning hall and the external plating. The section is sealed, but losing atmosphere at 0.3% per minute. Heating has failed completely in the sealed area. Temperature is dropping. How many inside? Paleth asked. 43 children. 3 teachers. The corridor went very quiet. Send repair drones, Paleth ordered. We tried. The ion interference is too strong. The drones cannot navigate the crawlway. They shut down within 30 seconds of entering. Then send engineers in manually. The 2 Vren engineers looked at each other. Neither spoke. The Telic security officer stopped pacing and stared at the floor. Nobody moved. Dale understood why. Crawlway 14C was one of the tightest spaces on the station. It had been built as a utility access tunnel, never meant for regular use. It was barely wide enough for a human to squeeze through on their stomach. For a Vren, with their rigid exoskeleton and wide thorax, it was physically impossible. For a Telic, with their broad shoulders and thick limbs, it was the same. Even a smaller species on the station would struggle. The crawlway was near the outer hull, which meant it was already freezing cold. With the fracture open, it would be losing pressure too. Anyone who went in there would be working in near-vacuum conditions with dropping temperature and no room to move. It was a death trap. And everyone standing in that corridor knew it. Paleth's communicator chirped. A teacher's voice came through, thin and frightened. This is Instructor Miv in the learning hall. The children are scared. It is getting cold. Please, how long until you reach us? Paleth looked at her engineers. They looked at their feet. She looked at the security officer. He shook his head slowly. Nobody answered the teacher. Dale stood at the back of the group. He looked at the bulkhead door. He looked at the readout on the wall showing the temperature inside section 14 dropping degree by degree. He thought about 43 children sitting in the dark, getting colder, getting more scared with every passing minute. He thought about Sarah, the little Relavi girl with the loud laugh and the sharp tongue. She was probably in there right now. He thought about wolves. He thought about brick houses. He thought about his grandmother's voice doing all the characters. Then he stepped forward. I'm going in. Dale said it the way he said everything. Quiet. Flat. Like he was announcing he was going to fix a light switch. Every head in the corridor turned toward him. Counselor Paleth's compound eyes locked onto his face with an expression that might have been disbelief if her species had been capable of showing it. You cannot be serious, she said. The crawlway is losing pressure. The outer hull temperature is dropping past the survivable range for most organic life. The ion storm is still active, which means radiation levels in that section are elevated and rising. I know, Dale said. He was already walking toward his workshop. That is why I need my welding rig. Paleth followed him with 2 of her 4 arms, gesturing sharply. Mechanic Rowan, I cannot authorize a crew member to enter a section with active hull breach during an ongoing ion event. The liability alone would. There are 43 kids in there, Dale said without turning around. He reached his workshop and began pulling gear from the shelves. Emergency oxygen pack, good for about 45 minutes. Portable welding unit, small enough to drag through a crawlway. Sealant canisters. Thermal gloves. A headlamp he strapped over his forehead. He moved with the calm speed of a man who had prepared for emergencies so many times that the preparation itself was muscle memory. The temperature inside that sealed section will reach critical for the Relavi children within 90 minutes, Dale said, stuffing sealant canisters into his belt pouches. The Telic young have slightly better cold resistance, maybe 2 hours. After that, you will not be rescuing anyone. You will be recovering bodies. The corridor went silent. Paleth's 4 arms went still. There is no one else who can fit in that crawlway and survive long enough to make the repair, Dale continued. You know it. Your engineers know it. So either you authorize me to go, or I go without authorization and you write me up for it later. Either way, I am going. Paleth stared at him for a long moment. Then she stepped aside. Do not die in my station, she said. The paperwork would be enormous. Dale almost smiled. Almost. The entrance to crawlway 14C was a narrow hatch in the wall near the section 14 bulkhead. It was barely 70 centimeters wide and 50 centimeters tall. Dale had to get on his stomach and pull himself through head first, dragging his equipment bag behind him on a short tether. The moment he entered, the world shrank to metal walls on every side, close enough to scrape his shoulders if he turned wrong. The cold hit him immediately. It was not the kind of cold you felt on a winter morning. It was the cold of space bleeding through thin metal, a cold that sank past skin and muscle and settled into bone. Dale's breath came out in white clouds that hung in the still air of the crawlway. The headlamp on his forehead threw a shaking cone of light ahead of him, illuminating rusted bolts, old wiring bundles, and the gray metal walls that pressed in from every direction. He began to crawl. The crawlway was about 60 meters long. Under normal conditions, it would have taken Dale 10 minutes to traverse. These were not normal conditions. The floor was covered in a thin layer of frost. His gloves slipped on the metal. Every few meters, a pipe or a cable bundle jutted out from the wall, forcing him to twist his body around it. The oxygen pack on his back scraped against the ceiling. The equipment bag behind him caught on every obstacle, and the air was getting thinner. He could feel it in his lungs, each breath giving him a little less than the one before. The fracture was pulling atmosphere out of the crawlway like a slow drain. His ears popped. His eyes watered. Dale talked to himself as he crawled. It was something he had done since he was young, a habit his grandmother had taught him for staying calm when things got hard. But he was not reciting engineering specs or emergency procedures. He was reciting a story. Once upon a time, he muttered between breaths, dragging himself over a frozen pipe junction. There were 3 little pigs, and each one set out to build a house. His right hand found a sharp edge in the dark. It sliced through his glove and into his palm. He hissed through his teeth and kept crawling. The first little pig built his house out of straw. It was quick. It was easy. He thought he was very clever. The temperature dropped another degree. Dale's fingers were going numb inside his gloves. He flexed them as he moved, tried to keep blood flowing. The headlamp flickered. He tapped it with his bleeding hand, and it steadied. The second little pig built his house out of sticks. It was a bit stronger, a bit better, but still not enough. He could see the fracture now. His headlamp caught the spot where the crawlway's inner wall had cracked, a jagged split running about 15 centimeters along a welded seam. Through the crack, he could see the outer hull plating, and beyond that, a faint shimmer where the station's weakened shields met the fury of the ion storm. Air whistled through the gap with a thin, keening sound, like a scream heard from very far away. Dale stopped crawling. He lay on his stomach in the freezing dark, breathing thin air, bleeding from one hand, staring at a crack that separated 43 children from the void of space. He pulled his equipment bag alongside him and opened it with stiff fingers. "And the third little pig," he said quietly, pulling out his welding unit and his first canister of sealant, "built his house out of bricks." He got to work. Inside the learning hall, the lights had gone out 12 minutes ago. The emergency strips along the floor gave off a dull orange glow that barely reached the ceiling, turning the room into a cave of long shadows and small, frightened faces. 43 children sat in clusters on the floor, pressed together for warmth that their bodies could barely produce. The Relavi children suffered the worst. Their thin blue skin was not built for cold. They huddled in tight groups with their arms wrapped around each other, shivering so hard their teeth clicked. The Telic youngsters with their dense fur fared a little better, and some of them had instinctively moved to sit around the Relavi children, forming living blankets of warm bodies. Even in crisis, children found ways to help each other. Sarah sat in the middle of one of these clusters. She was not laughing now. Her oversized eyes were wide and wet and fixed on the sealed bulkhead door that refused to open no matter how many times the teachers pressed the override panel. Her thin arms were wrapped around 2 younger Relavi children who pressed against her sides. She could feel them trembling. She was trembling too, but she was trying very hard not to show it, because the little ones were watching her, and she was the oldest in this group. Instructor Miv, a Telic teacher with kind eyes and shaking hands, had been trying to reach the command deck on her communicator for the last 10 minutes. The responses were broken, distorted by ion interference. Fragments of Palitha's voice came through, words like "working on it" and "hold position" that meant nothing to children who could see their own breath forming clouds in the air. Miv tried to keep them calm. She gathered the children closer and began to tell a story, a traditional telic tale about the formation of their homeworld's 3 moons. But her voice cracked halfway through, and the children could hear the fear in it, and the story died in the cold air between them. Nobody spoke for a while after that. The only sounds were the hum of the failing emergency systems and the quiet whimpering of the youngest children. Meanwhile, 60 meters away, inside the crawlway, Dale Rowan was fighting. The fracture was worse than the sensors had reported. What looked like a 15-centimeter crack on the diagnostic readout was actually a 20-centimeter split with secondary stress fractures branching off in 2 directions. The welded seam had not just cracked. It had begun to separate. Another hour of the ion storm beating against the outer hull, and the whole section of wall could peel open. Dale worked on his stomach in a space so tight he could not fully extend his arms. He had to make every movement count. He started with the sealant, pressing it into the main crack with his fingers because there was not enough room to use the applicator gun. The sealant was rated for vacuum conditions and would harden into a bond stronger than the original metal, but it needed 30 seconds to set, and the escaping air kept trying to push it back out of the gap. He held it in place with his bare hand. His glove on that hand was already torn from the cut he had taken on the way in, and the sealant burned against his skin as it hardened. He clenched his jaw and did not pull away. 30 seconds. He counted them in his head. Then he moved to the welding unit. In the tight space of the crawlway, using a welder was dangerous. The sparks had nowhere to go. They bounced off the walls and ceiling and landed on his coveralls, on his arms, on the back of his neck. He smelled burning fabric and burning skin and kept working. He ran a bead of weld along each of the secondary stress fractures, sealing them shut, reinforcing the metal around the main crack. His oxygen pack beeped a warning. 20 minutes of air left. The cold was deep inside him now. His fingers moved slowly. His thoughts moved slowly. But his hands knew what to do. They had been fixing things for 30 years. They did not need his brain to be fast. They just needed it to be steady. When the main crack was sealed, he turned to the heating line. It ran along the left wall of the crawlway, a thick insulated pipe that carried warm air from the station's central heating system to Section 14. The ion storm had knocked out the heating relay that fed it, and without that relay, the pipe was just dead metal. But Dale knew the station's systems the way a doctor knew a patient's veins. He knew there was a secondary feed line 2 junctions back that was still active. All he needed to do was reroute it. He had no schematics. The diagnostic tablets could not function in the ion interference. He worked from memory, crawling backward to the junction, locating the secondary feed by touch alone, and cross-connecting it to the main heating pipe using a manual valve that he had to turn with both hands because it was rusted nearly shut. The valve screamed as it turned. Metal ground against metal. Dale's arm shook with effort. Then it gave way, and he felt the pipe beside him shudder as warm air rushed through it. Inside the learning hall, something changed. The heating vents in the ceiling coughed once, twice, and then began pushing warm air into the room. It was not much at first, just a gentle current that smelled faintly of machine oil, but it was warm, and the children felt it immediately. Heads lifted, eyes opened. The shivering eased by a fraction. Then the emergency lights brightened. The pressure readout on the wall, which had been slowly dropping for the last half hour, stopped. It held steady. Then, slowly, it began to climb back up. The children did not understand what was happening. They did not know that somewhere on the other side of the wall, a human man was lying in a frozen crawlway with burned hands and a cut palm and 7 minutes of oxygen left, watching the same pressure readout on a tiny gauge and allowing himself, for the first time, to breathe. Miv's communicator crackled. Palitha's voice came through, clear this time. Section 14. Hull integrity restored. Pressure stabilizing. Heating restored. Hold your position. We are opening the bulkheads now. The children cheered. They screamed and cried and hugged each other and hugged their teachers. Sarah buried her face in her hands and sobbed without making a sound. On the other side of the wall, Dale closed his eyes and pressed his forehead against the cold metal floor. He was exhausted. His hands hurt. His lungs ached. But the wall was sealed. The air was holding. The heat was flowing. The house was standing. The wolf had not gotten in. They pulled Dale out of the crawlway 4 hours after the ion storm finally passed. Two telemedics had to reach in and drag him the last 10 meters because he had run out of the strength to crawl. When they got him into the corridor and rolled him onto his back, the medical scanner in the senior medic's hands beeped with a list of injuries that would have hospitalized most species for weeks. Second-degree burns across both forearms. A deep laceration on his right palm. Mild frostbite on 6 fingers. Bruised ribs from squeezing through tight sections. Oxygen deprivation that had left his blood levels dangerously low. Dale looked up at the medics and said, "Are the kids okay?" The senior medic, who had treated hundreds of patients and prided himself on professional composure, had to look away for a moment before answering. All 43 children and 3 teachers. Safe. No injuries. Dale closed his eyes and nodded. Then he let them put him on a stretcher and carry him to the medical bay on level 2. He healed fast. Deathworlder biology was built for damage and recovery. The burn scabbed over within 2 days. The frostbite faded. The cut on his palm would leave a scar, but Dale had plenty of those already. Within 3 days, he was sitting up in his medical bed, arguing with the doctor about when he could go back to work because he was certain the pressure regulator on level 3 had gotten worse during the storm and nobody else would know how to fix it properly. Word spread through Bridgepoint the way it always did on small stations, fast, unevenly, and with growing layers of exaggeration. By the second day, the story had Dale crawling through vacuum with no oxygen at all. By the third day, someone claimed he had welded the hull shut with his bare hands. The truth was dramatic enough without the additions, but that never stopped a good story from growing. Counselor Paleth came to see him on the second day. She stood at the foot of his bed with all 4 arms folded, her compound eyes unreadable. She was silent for a long time. Dale waited. He had learned that Paleth was not comfortable with words that were not part of official reports. "I have filed a formal commendation in your personnel record," she said finally. "Your actions during the Ion Storm event preserved 46 lives and prevented a catastrophic structural failure in Section 14. The Station Council has approved a grade increase and a bonus allocation for your next pay cycle." "Thank you," Dale said. Paleth did not move. She stood there, and something in her posture shifted, something small that Dale might have missed if he had not spent 6 years learning to read alien body language. Her arms loosened slightly. Her head tilted a fraction to the left. "I also wish to say," she continued, and her voice was different now, less like an administrator and more like a person, "that I was wrong to hesitate at the bulkhead. When you said you were going in, my first instinct was to stop you. Not because I doubted your ability, because I did not believe any crew member would voluntarily enter those conditions for children who were not their own species." She paused. "I was wrong about what motivates your kind. I will not make that mistake again." Dale looked at her for a moment. "They were kids," he said simply. "That is all that mattered." Paleth nodded once, turned sharply, and left. Dale heard her footsteps clicking down the corridor, steady and precise as always, but perhaps just slightly slower than usual. Grinna visited that afternoon with a basket of warm pastries from a Finn bakery 3 systems away that she had been saving for a special occasion. She sat beside his bed and did not say anything about the crawlway or the storm or the rescue. She just talked about her shop and the new fabric she had ordered and whether Dale thought the station's lighting was too blue on level 3. Normal things. Small things. It was exactly what he needed. But the moment that mattered most came on the 5th day, when Dale was back in his workshop, his hands freshly bandaged, sorting through his tools and checking which ones had been damaged during the rush to gear up. He heard small footsteps in the corridor outside. Then a knock on the open door. He turned around. Sarah stood in the doorway. Behind her, a group of about 15 children crowded the corridor, peeking around each other to see inside. Ralavi, Telek, and a couple of species Dale did not immediately recognize. They were quiet in a way that children are only quiet when they're feeling something too big for their small bodies to contain. Sarah stepped inside. She was holding something behind her back. Her oversized eyes were fixed on the floor. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "You are the one who fixed the wall," she said. It was not a question. I am, Dale said. You came through the tunnel. In the cold. With no air. She looked up at him. Why? Dale set down the wrench he was holding. He pulled a stool from beside his workbench and sat down so that he was closer to her eye level. The other children edged into the room behind Sarah, watching him with wide eyes. You remember those stories you heard the other day? He asked. The ones you laughed at? Sarah flinched. Yes. There's one about 3 little pigs, Dale said. Each one builds a house. The first pig builds with straw. Quick and easy. The second pig builds with sticks. A little better, but still not enough. And the third pig builds with bricks. It takes longer. It is harder. Nobody helps him. The other 2 pigs think he is wasting his time. Dale tapped the metal wall of his workshop with his knuckle. It rang solid and deep. Then the wolf comes. And he huffs and he puffs. He blows down the straw house. He blows down the stick house. But the brick house holds. And all 3 pigs survive because the one who did the hard work never gave up. The children were completely still. Sarah had not blinked. That is what those silly stories taught me, Dale said. They taught me to be the one who builds the brick house. The one who does the hard work when nobody is watching and holds the line when everything else falls down. That is why I went into the tunnel. Because someone had to be the brick house for you. Sarah stood there for a long moment, her thin blue hands trembling at her sides. Then she brought out what she had been hiding behind her back. It was a drawing on a sheet of station paper. A picture of a small brick house with a smiling face on it, standing strong while wind blew all around it. Above it, in the careful, uneven handwriting of a child, were the words, "Thank you, Brickman." Dale took the drawing. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Sarah and said, "Would you like to hear the whole story?" All the voices. Sarah nodded. The children behind her nodded. They gathered around him on the workshop floor, sitting among the tools and spare parts and grease stains. And Dale Rowan, the mechanic nobody noticed, told them the story of the 3 little pigs from beginning to end. He did all the voices, just like his grandmother used to do. The wolf, the pigs, all of them. And this time, nobody laughed.